The wind carries the smell of damp leaves and rust. It's the kind of morning where the sun seems in no hurry to rise, where light drips slowly through the branches, laying pale gold across a tired neighborhood. Playground. The swings creak lazily in the breeze, their chains shivering against the metal frame. The paint on the slide is peeling, strips of green curling away to reveal the dull silver beneath. At the far end, a merry-go-round turns without anyone on it, just the steady push of the wind round and round like a memory that refuses to stop spinning. In 1970, this was the heart of a small Midwestern town, the sort of place where the sound of a screen door slamming could tell you which neighbor's kid had just been called in for lunch, where everyone knew each other's names and thought they knew each other's hearts. And that's what makes this story so hard to tell, because what happened here on one crisp Saturday morning didn't just take a little boy away from his family, it tore something invisible from this town, something it never got back. On that morning, children's voices rose and fell like birdsong. They called out from the slide, the jungle gym, the sandbox, their shouts tumbling into each other like marbles in a tin can. Mothers sat on the wooden benches sipping coffee from thermoses, knitting scarves for the winter they knew was coming. Fathers leaned on the chain-link fence, trading stories about football games and fishing trips. It was a scene that could have been painted wholesome, fleeting, perfectly ordinary, and maybe that's the cruelest part about it. No one notices when the last moment of ordinary slips by. There's a photograph taken by a local hobbyist that morning. It's grainy, washed in the faded tones of 1970s film stock. In it, you can see the entire playground framed by oaks whose leaves had turned to fire. You can see children clinging to the monkey bars mid-laugh. You can see a boy in a striped sweater, his feet barely touching the ground as he leans forward on a swing. His hair catches the sun in a way that almost makes a halo. That boy's name was Daniel Whitmore, 8 years old, quiet, thoughtful, a little shy, the kind of child who watched the world before joining in that frozen frame. He looks happy, untouched, whole. By the end of the day, he would be gone. The locals still remember the weather that day, how the air had that first real bite of autumn, how the sky was so clear it felt endless. They remember the smell of burning leaves from a yard, 2 streets over, the sound of a radio somewhere playing bridge over troubled water, little fragments held in place like beads on a string, because that's what people cling to when the bigger picture is too painful to face. And the bigger picture was this: a boy left home to play at the park. He never came back. But before the headlines, before the police reports, and the grainy black and white missing posters stapled to telephone poles, there was this an hour, maybe less, where nothing seemed wrong. Daniel ran to the swings, his sister Emily trailing behind with a book tucked under her arm. She was 14, too old for playground games, but not yet old enough to stop watching over her little brother. She remembers the way his sneakers scuffed the dirt as he pumped his legs higher and higher until his laughter seemed to lift with him into the wind. She remembers thinking she'd read just one chapter, just one, before it was time to walk him home for lunch. She didn't know that the sound of his laughter, that light-aired joy, was something she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. The first shadow fell in silence. No scream, no cry for help, just absence. One moment Daniel's swing arced forward, his feet reaching for the sky. The next it drifted empty. The other children kept playing, the parents kept chatting. Even Emily, eyes down in her book, didn't notice right away. It was only when she looked up, a reflex, a sister's instinct, that she realized she couldn't see him anywhere. Her gaze swept the sandbox, the slide, the merry-go-round. Nothing. She called his name once, half playful. The second time it cracked. This is the moment people rarely talk about, the moment between knowing something is wrong and admitting it out loud. It's a kind of free fall where your heart races, but your mind scrambles to tell you it's fine, you're overreacting. Emily searched the edges of the park. She walked the path to the public restrooms, circled back. She asked 2 boys by the basketball court if they'd seen her brother. They shrugged, already drifting away into their own game. And then the wind picked up. It rattled the swing chains and spun the merry-go-round again. Somewhere a mother's voice called for her own child. And for a moment, Emily imagined it was her mother calling for Daniel. But her mother was at home, thinking both her children were safe. The rest, the full panic, the search, the calls to the police, would come later. For now, there's just this image burned into memory: a playground bathed in golden, empty swings swaying, and the first real taste of fear. This is where our story begins, with a picture-perfect morning that shattered before anyone knew they were standing on broken glass. 55 years later, Daniel's sister would break her silence. She would place an unmarked cassette tape on a table, its plastic cloudy with age, and say, "It's time I tell you what I've been keeping all these years." And when you hear what's on that tape, you'll understand why this story has never really ended. The day before Daniel vanished was one of those soft, warm Fridays that linger in memory like an old song. The sky was clear, the late afternoon light laying itself gently across the town, like it had nowhere else to be. In Emily's recollection, there was nothing extraordinary about that day, and maybe that's why it haunts her so much. If she'd seen a storm coming, she might have done something differently, but the day unfolded like all the others and ended with a shadow no one could name. The Whitmore family lived in a modest two-story house on Birch Street, just 4 blocks from the playground. Its paint had begun to flake, curling at the edges, and the porch steps groaned under every footstep. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of coffee and laundry soap layered over with something else, a tension Emily had learned to feel without fully understanding. Her father, Charles, was a mechanic. His hands always smelled faintly of oil and iron, his shirt pockets forever holding little folded scraps of paper covered in numbers. He was quiet in a way that made people assume he was kind, but his silences sometimes had sharp edges. Her mother, Irene, worked part-time at the town library, which meant she spent most afternoons surrounded by books, a safe, orderly place where nothing could sneak up on her. At home, though, she moved like someone perpetually bracing for an argument. Emily had begun to notice those moments, the low-voiced exchanges in the kitchen when they thought the children were outside, the way her father's jaw tightened, the way her mother's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her apron. On that Friday, Emily walked home from school with Daniel. His small hand clung to hers until they reached their block. When he pulled away to run ahead, his satchel bouncing against his back, he turned to grin at her teeth, slightly crooked hair falling in his eyes. "Race you to the porch," he shouted. She didn't race him. She just watched, smiling in spite of herself, thinking how he always moved like the world was a game. Dinner was meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Daniel drowned his plate in ketchup, and Emily rolled her eyes, but didn't say anything. Across the table, their parents talked about bills, about the cost of fixing the washing machine, about a man in town who'd been asking after work. That's when Emily saw it, her mother's eyes flicking to her father's, something unspoken passing between them. Then her mother's voice softer. "We'll talk about it later." Daniel was too busy sculpting his mashed potatoes into a volcano to notice, but Emily felt the shift, the kind that doesn't make sense to you at 14, but still lodges deep in your chest. After dinner, Daniel begged her to play marbles with him on the porch. The air was cooling, the cicadas buzzing their last songs of summer. She let him win the first 2 rounds just to see his face light up. "Tomorrow, we're going to the park," he said suddenly, as if making an announcement. "I'm going to get the highest swing in the whole world." Emily laughed higher than last week, way higher. He grinned. "He'll touch the clouds." It was such a Daniel thing to say, that certainty, that belief in magic stitched into the edges of ordinary life. Later, Emily sat cross-legged on her bed, writing in her journal. She could hear her parents' voices downstairs, muted but urgent. She couldn't make out the words, only the tone, her father's low and steady, her mother's sharper, cracking in places. Then a sudden silence, like someone had realized they weren't alone in the house. Daniel was asleep then curled on his side, one arm thrown over his pillow. She watched him for a moment in the dim light from the hallway, the rise and fall of his small shoulders. It's strange, she would later think, how you can look at someone without knowing it's the last night you'll ever see them. If there were signs, they were too quiet to hear. A blue sedan parked on the opposite curb for longer than usual. A man at the corner store asking the clerk what time the playground closed. A neighbor's dog barking at something unseen near the alley, all of it invisible to Emily. Then details only stitched together in hindsight like a map. No one knew they were drawing. The night ended like countless others. The sound of the TV murmuring downstairs, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smell of leaves through the half-open window. Emily fell asleep thinking about a book she'd borrowed from the library, its pages still warm from her mother's hand. Somewhere in the darkness, the clock in the hallway ticked away the last safe hours of their lives. The next morning, Daniel would run ahead to the swings. The sunlight would fall the same way it always had, and before anyone knew it, the world would tilt and nothing would be right again. The morning of October 17th, 1970 began like any other Saturday. The air was cool, but not cold, the kind of morning where a light jacket feels comforting but unnecessary. A pale sun climbed above the rooftops, gilding the playground down the street. Emily and Daniel left the house just after 10. Emily carried a paperback novel tucked under her arm, The Secret Garden, pages already curling from overuse, and Daniel had a battered red lunchbox that rattled faintly. When he walked inside were 2 oatmeal cookies, and a slingshot. He wasn't supposed to have. The streets were quiet except for the occasional rumble of a passing car. Fallen leaves gathered along the curbs, crunching under Daniel's sneakers as he zigzagged down the sidewalk, hopping from one crack in the pavement to the next. Race you to the swings, he called, not waiting for an answer. Emily didn't chase him. She just let him run the side of his striped sweater, bobbing ahead of her, a comfort she didn't have. The words for the playground was already alive with children, the shriek of a girl on the slide, the hollow clang of a seesaw hitting the ground, the hum of the merry-go-round turning in lazy circles. The air smelled faintly of wood chips and iron. Daniel headed straight for the swings, claiming the second one from the left his favorite because it goes the highest. He dropped his lunchbox in the dirt and climbed on, pumping his legs until the chains groaned in protest. Emily found a bench in the shade, opened her book, and let the words pull her under. It's strange, she would later recall, how quickly it all happened, how you can look away for the length of a paragraph and find the world rearranged when you look back. One moment Daniel's laughter rang clear above the other playground noise. The next, there was only the wind. She looked up expecting to see him dragging his lunchbox toward the jungle gym, but he wasn't there. Her eyes swept the slide, the sandbox, the clusters of children trading baseball cards or chasing each other. Nothing. Danny, she called lightly, her voice meant to tease. No answer. She stood scanning the far edge of the playground where the chain-link fence bordered the grassy lot. Still nothing. Danny, louder this time. A boy by the monkey bars shrugged. When she asked if had seen him, he was swinging, he said, already turning back to his game. Emily began walking the perimeter, her heart ticking faster. She checked the restrooms, the path that led toward the baseball diamond, even the parking lot where a few cars idled in the late morning sun. A blue sedan sat near the far end, engine off, windows rolled up. She noticed it because she didn't recognize it, and in a town like theirs, every car was familiar. But when she looked closer, there was no one inside. By the time she circled back to the swings, the seat Daniel had been on was swaying gently, as if it had only just been emptied. His lunchbox still sat in the dirt, lid snapped shut. That was when the first thread of panic tightened in her chest. She tried to tell herself had wandered to the candy shop 2 blocks away, or maybe had gone to find their friend Tommy, who sometimes played stickball behind the church. But the logic was thin. Daniel never left without telling her. Her voice rose each time she called his name until it began to draw looks from other parents. A woman knitting on a bench set down her needles. A father near the basketball court began glancing toward the exits. Within minutes, people she didn't even know were scanning the grounds, calling out, peering behind the jungle gym, checking the bathroom stalls. The sounds of the playground changed. The easy laughter thinned, replaced by sharper voices, hurried footsteps, the occasional shout. Emily's breathing quickened. The world felt too bright, the sun too hot on her face. Every second that passed seemed to stretch slow and thicken, as if time itself was resisting her. Someone suggested checking the wooded strip behind the park. Emily ran there herself, leaves snapping under her feet, the air cooler and damp in the shade. She found nothing but the smell of wet soil and the sound of a distant train whistle. By noon, the search had spread to the streets surrounding the park. Shop owners stood in their doorways, scanning the sidewalks. Teenagers on bikes pedaled slow loops around the block. A police cruiser arrived, its presence making the situation feel suddenly undeniably real. The officer's voice was calm but firm as he asked Emily for a description: height, weight, hair, color, what he was wearing. She stumbled over the answers, her mind replaying the moment she last saw him on the swing, the way his feet kicked higher into the sky. When she told them about the blue sedan, the officer's eyes sharpened. He scribbled a note, but said nothing. The minutes blurred into hours. The longer Daniel was gone, the more the air seemed to press in, heavy and unyielding. By mid-afternoon, the playground was empty except for the police and a few neighbors who refused to go home. The swing Daniel had claimed that morning still moved just slightly, as if holding onto the ghost of his laughter that night. When Emily lay in bed, she could still hear the metallic creak of those chains. She would hear it again and again over the years, in her dreams, in the wind, in the hollow spaces of her memory, and she would remember the moment she knew deep down that her brother wasn't just hiding, he was gone. By the time the October sun dipped behind the church steeple, the Whitmore family's front yard had become something unrecognizable. Patrol cars lined the curb, their red lights turning the pale siding of the house into a pulse of warning. Neighbors stood in clusters at the edges of the lawn, voices hushed, faces drawn. Inside, the living room was stripped of its usual warmth. The television sat dark. The smell of coffee was thick in the air, though no one was drinking it. Emily sat on the couch between her Parents her hands twisting the hem of her sweater every time the front door opened. A gust of cold air swept in carrying the scent of damp leaves. An exhaust. The lead investigator was a man named Detective Frank Harris, tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep crease between his brows that looked permanent. He spoke in a steady, unhurried tone, the kind people confuse for patience, though it was really something closer to detachment. He took notes in a small, leather-bound pad, nodding as Emily repeated what Shed told the officer at the park: the striped sweater, the red lunchbox, the swing, the blue sedan parked at the edge of the lot. Did you see anyone in the car? Harris asked. She shook her head. No, the windows were up. Anyone near the playground who seemed out of place? Emily hesitated. I don't know, maybe. I wasn't looking. She felt her father shift beside her, the weight of his hand briefly touching her shoulder before retreating outside. Officers combed through the yard, the street, the park too. Uniformed men went door to door showing a small school photo of Daniel to anyone who answered his smile, and that picture was crooked, half shy, his hair sticking up at the crown. Seeing it in strangers' hands made Emily feel suddenly lightheaded, as though the air had thinned. By 9 p.m. the search had expanded beyond the park. Flashlights bobbed through the wooded strip at the edge of town. Volunteer searchers moved in lines across the fields, their boots breaking the crust of early frost. The hum of walkie-talkies filled the air inside the Whitmore living room. Harris questioned their parents in the kitchen, voices too low for Emily to hear clearly. Every now and then her mother's voice lifted, sharp, breaking, before dropping back into a whisper. When her father returned to the couch, his expression was carved from something hard. They're doing everything they can, he said, though his eyes didn't meet hers. Around midnight, Harris gathered his team in the yard. The front porch lights spilled across their shoulders, turning their breath into pale clouds in the cold air. Emily watched from the window, unable to hear, but she could read the change in their posture, the stiffness, the glances toward the house. It was the moment the search shifted from finding a boy who wandered off to finding evidence of something worse. In the days that followed, the investigation unfolded in a rhythm Emily would come to dread. Mornings began with phone calls, police updates, tips from strangers who swore they'd seen a boy matching Daniel's description at a gas station, a diner, a bus stop. By afternoon, those leads would collapse. Reporters came, their questions framed in the polite urgency of people chasing a story. One woman from the local paper asked Emily what she remembered about the last words Shed exchanged with her brother. Emily froze, her mind going blank, and the woman's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she scribbled something down. Anyway, the police interviewed everyone who'd been at the park that morning. Parents, children, even the groundskeeper who mowed the grass once a week. The blue sedan remained their most promising lead, but no one could identify it. One boy claimed had seen Daniel talking to a man in a brown jacket near the edge of the playground, but his description shifted each time he told it. Another child swore Daniel had gone to the drinking fountain, but the timeline didn't fit. Harris told the family they were keeping all possibilities open, but Emily could feel his attention drifting as though the case were already beginning to cool. 3 days and the search perimeter widened again. They brought in dogs. Emily stood in the park as handlers let the animals sniff one of Daniel's sweaters, watching them pull against their leashes, disappearing into the trees. She felt something close to hope, but when they returned hours later, panting, their handlers shaking their heads, the hope turned brittle and fell apart. At night, Emily lay awake listening to her parents' muffled arguments through the wall. Words like money and work and can't keep doing this rose and fell between them. She wondered if they were fighting about her, if they thought she hadn't watched Daniel closely enough, but no one said it aloud. After a week, the officers stopped searching the park every day. After 2 weeks, the reporters stopped coming. The flyers stapled to telephone poles, taped to shop windows, began to curl at the edges, the ink bleeding from rain. And then, without warning, there were no more updates. Harris stopped calling as often. The patrol cars no longer lingered near their street. It was as if the town had agreed silently to fold the case away like a photograph in a drawer. Emily would remember that silence more than anything, the way it settled over the house, heavy and permanent, filling every corner. She would remember, too, the one thing she hadn't told Detective Harris, the thing she kept tucked away, not because she didn't think it mattered, but because she was terrified it mattered too much. The tape. The first thing to fade was the noise. For 2 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, the neighborhood had been a living, breathing search party. You couldn't step outside without hearing voices calling his name, radios crackling with updates, the rhythmic stomp of boots combing the edges of fields. And then, without warning, the sound thinned, the radios went quiet, the voices stopped carrying across the streets. It was as if the town had collectively decided that enough had been done, that anything more was a kind of indulgence they couldn't afford. By November, the missing posters had begun to peel from the telephone poles, their corners curling into brittle rolls. Rain had blurred Daniel's photograph into a ghostly version of itself, the black ink of his name bleeding down the page like it was trying to escape. Shopkeepers still kept one in their windows, but only because no one had come to take it down. People stopped looking at them at school. Emily felt the shift most clearly in those early days. Classmates had approached her with wide, solemn eyes, asking if there was any news in the careful tone kids use when they've been told not to upset someone. Teachers had been gentler, excusing late homework, letting her sit out of gym. But as the weeks passed, the questions became fewer. Then they stopped altogether. Her absence at the playground went unnoticed. Her silence at lunch was no longer a pause in the day's chatter. It simply became part of the background. The Whitmore house itself seemed to sag under the weight of absence. Her mother, once meticulous, let the laundry pile in the corner of the living room. Dishes stayed in the sink longer. The radio, which used to play softly through the afternoons, sat silent. Her father came home later, and later the smell of engine grease clinging to him, his eyes avoiding hers. The three of them moved through the house like pieces on separate game boards, their paths rarely crossing except at dinner, and even then the table felt wrong. One chair sat empty, its plate unused, but still set out of habit. They didn't speak much, and when they did, it was never about Daniel. The town itself seemed eager to stitch over the wound. By Christmas, the park had been decorated with strings of colored lights. Children laughed again on the swings. Parents waved to each other, voices light. If Daniel's name was spoken, Emily didn't hear it. It was in this silence that her grief took root, not the kind that bursts into tears, but the kind that sits like a stone in the stomach, heavy and unmoving. She began walking the long way home from school, cutting past the park just to see the swings. One in particular, second from the left, still leaned slightly to one side, its chain kinked in the same spot. She wondered if anyone else noticed, or if it was now just part of the scenery. The weeks bled into months. By spring, the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance was just another date on the calendar. The local paper printed a short article, 3 paragraphs, ending with "Anyone with information is encouraged to contact the authorities." That was the only time she saw his name in print that year. And yet in the quiet, something began to grow, a thought Emily kept pressing down, but could never fully bury. The tape. It sat in the back of her desk drawer, tucked between loose-leaf pages of school notes and a stack of letters from an old pen pal. She hadn't listened to it since the day she made it, not intentionally anyway. She told herself it was just background noise from the park. Nothing important, but in her dreams, she sometimes heard Daniel's voice on it. And another voice, one she knew. She told herself she wasn't ready. She told herself no one would believe her. And as the town moved on, as the police stopped calling, as even her parents stopped speaking Daniel's name, it became easier to believe that the tape was better left unheard. For 50 years, she kept it that way, until the day she decided to tell someone. The living room smelled faintly of rain that afternoon. It was early October again, 55 years to the month since Daniel disappeared, and the air outside carried that same bite of autumn, that same low gray sky that seemed to press the world closer to the ground. Emily sat across from me in an old armchair, the kind with faded floral fabric and armrests worn smooth by restless hands. Her posture was straight, but her fingers fidgeted with the edge of a cardigan sleeve pulling at a loose thread. Without seeming to notice, her hair, now silver, was pulled back in a simple knot. Her eyes, the same blue as her brother's, watched me with a mixture of hesitation and resolve. "I've never told anyone this," she began, her voice low and steady. A pause, the sound of rain tapping against the window. "Not the police, not my parents, not even my husband." She reached down beside the chair and lifted a small cardboard shoebox onto her lap. Its corners were softened with age, the lid sagging slightly. She held it like it was fragile, though it was far too light to be breakable. "I kept something from that day," she said, her gaze fixed on the box, "something I should have handed over 50 years ago." When she removed the lid, the smell of dust rose faintly, a scent so dry it seemed to belong to another era. Inside was a cassette tape, its clear plastic now clouded and yellowed with age. A strip of masking tape clung to one side, the glue brittle, the surface blank. No label, no markings. "I recorded it by accident," Emily said. "On my father's tape recorder. He used it for work, sometimes to make notes about repairs. I borrowed it that morning to work on a school project. I was supposed to be interviewing kids at the park about their favorite games, mostly I just let it run while Daniel played I Forgot It Was Even On. She held the cassette delicately between her fingers, as if afraid her grip might crush at the silence in the room. Stretched outside a car past its tires, hissing on the wet street. Why didn't you give it to the police? I asked. Finally, her eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment I saw the 14-year-old she'd once been, terrified, unsure, holding something too heavy for her age. Because I recognized the voice, she said. She leaned back in the chair, her gaze drifting toward the rain-blurred window. I didn't realize it right away. I didn't even listen to the whole thing until that night after the police left. I think I was hoping there'd be something there that would explain what happened, something that would make it make sense. But when I heard him speak, her voice caught just barely, and she pressed her lips together before continuing. It was someone we knew, someone who came to our house, someone my parents trusted. She didn't say his name, not yet. Her hand tightened around the cassette, and I noticed the tremor in her fingers. I was 14, she said, and I'd already learned that grown-ups don't always believe children, especially when the truth is ugly. My parents needed him. He helped my father get work when the shop was slow, had even brought us groceries once when my mother was sick. If I told them what I thought I'd heard, I don't know. I was afraid they'd look at me differently, afraid they'd think I was making it up. Her words hung in the air like dust motes in late light, small, weightless, and yet impossible to ignore. And the longer I kept it, she continued, the harder it became to imagine handing it over. Every year that passed made it feel more dangerous, like the tape wasn't just evidence, it was a confession of my own failure to speak sooner. The rain outside softened to a mist. Emily set the cassette back into the shoebox and closed the lid with deliberate care. I'm tired, she said, almost to herself, tired of carrying this, tired of wondering if someone else's silence cost my brother his life. She looked at me, then her gaze steady in a way that felt almost like a challenge. I want you to hear it, she said, but you have to understand, once you do, you can't unhear it. In that moment, the tape felt less like a piece of plastic and more like a door, one that had been locked for over half a century. Holding behind it something sharp enough to cut the hum of the old house deepened in the pause that followed. Somewhere in the kitchen, a clock ticked once, twice, 3 times. Then Emily leaned forward, slid the shoebox toward me, and whispered, "It's time." The cassette player sat between us on the coffee table, an old, bulky model Emily had pulled from a shelf in the hall closet. It looked like something salvaged from a school AV card. Its once white plastic, now the color of old paper. She set the shoebox beside it, removed the cassette, and turned it over in her hands once more. For a moment, I thought she might change her mind. "Last time I heard this," she said quietly, "was the night he disappeared." Her fingers slid the tape into the slot with a click that sounded louder than it should have. In the small, still room, the machine's buttons were worn smooth from years of use. Emily pressed play for a few seconds. There was only static, the dry, whispering hiss of magnetic tape aged half a century. Then faintly the sound of children laughing filtered through, distant but unmistakable. The background hum of the playground filled the room, squeaking swing chains, the scrape of sneakers on packed dirt, the metallic rattle of the merry-go-round turning. "That's him," Emily murmured, leaning forward, and there it was, Daniel's voice, high and light, carried on the wind. "Push me higher, Emmy," he called. The recording caught her own laugh in response, younger, freer. For a moment the sound was almost sweet. If you didn't know what came next, you could mistake it for nothing more than a fragment of a happy morning. A minute passed, then Daniel's voice again, closer, now talking to someone whose reply was too soft to hear. The tone in his voice changed, less playful, more curious. Another burst of static, and the other voice grew clearer. It was a man's voice, deep, smooth, with a faint drawl. "You don't have to go home yet, Danny," the man said. "I can show you something better." Even through the tinny distortion, the words landed heavy. Emily's jaw tightened. "That's the moment," she said. The recording crackled as Daniel hesitated. "What is it?" "You'll see," the man replied. There was a faint creak, a swing slowing, and then the sound of footsteps moving away, crunching over leaves. For several seconds, nothing but ambient noise, then the laughter of other children farther off, swallowing the space where Daniel's voice should have been. The tape hissed, warbled. Somewhere in the background, a faint car door thunked shut. An engine started, muffled, distant, then faded until there was nothing but the steady whisper of the tape. "That's all there is," Emily said after a moment. She reached out and pressed stop. The room seemed suddenly too quiet, as if even the rain outside had paused to listen. I sat back, my mind replaying the voice, not just the words, but the casual familiarity in them. This wasn't a stranger coaxing a child away. It was someone Daniel trusted. "You recognized him right away?" I asked. Emily nodded slowly. "We all knew that voice. He lived 2 streets over, came by the house all the time, brought fishing gear for Daniel once. She looked down at her hands. My parents thought the world of him. He was polite, generous, the kind of man who helped fix your fence without being asked if I told them I thought he had something to do with it. They'd have told me. I was imagining things. She reached for the tape again, turning it over, as if expecting it to yield something new. For years I told myself it couldn't be what it sounded like. She said that maybe he was talking about showing Danny a new game or a shortcut home. But every time I played it back, I could hear the truth a little clearer. Her voice dropped. He was taking him somewhere. I asked why she'd kept the tape all these years. Her answer came without hesitation, because it's the only piece of him I have left. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. Photographs fade, clothes wear out. But this has his voice on it. It's the last time I heard him laugh. The rain outside began again, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the window panes. The room felt smaller, now the air thicker. What do you want to do with it? I asked. Emily stared at the cassette, her expression unreadable. I think, she said slowly, it's time to let someone else hear it. The police, or someone who can do more than I could back. Then she placed the tape back into its box, closed the lid, and pushed it toward me. I'm done being the only one who knows what's on here. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew the voice on that tape wasn't just a clue, it was a key, and if we turned it, we might not like what it unlocked, but the door was already open a crack, and there was no closing it now. Emily didn't speak for a while after we played the tape. The only sound was the steady hum of the rain outside and the faint tick of the clock on the wall, a metronome for a silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the room. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than before. I think I've told myself 100 different reasons why I didn't say anything. She began. Some of them sound sensible, some of them sound like excuses, but the truth is I was afraid in ways I didn't even have words for. At 14, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed somewhere far behind me. In 1970, girls were taught to be polite before they were taught to be brave, to keep the peace, not to accuse people, especially men, of things you couldn't prove. I knew what that voice on the tape sounded like, but I also knew who it belonged to. Her fingers twisted the edge of her cardigan again, pulling the loose thread tighter. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was the man who lent my father tools when the shops broke, who brought us firewood during the winter, had show up on the porch with a bag of groceries and act like it was nothing. People liked him, trusted him. She glanced at me, her eyes sharp. For a moment, do you know what it's like to be a kid and realize that the person everyone thinks is good might be the one who hurt your family? And to know that if you say it out loud, people might hate you. Instead, her gaze dropped again. My parents, they needed him, and I needed them. I couldn't be the reason they lost both. She told me about the night she first listened to the tape alone. Her parents had gone to bed after another long day of talking to police and neighbors. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, the recorder balanced on her lap. She pressed play, and Daniel's voice filled the small space. She smiled at first. Hearing him laugh was like sunlight breaking through, and then came the man's voice. That voice, it was like ice water poured over me. She said I knew it wasn't right. I knew he wasn't supposed to be talking to Danny like that. But even then, she tried to convince herself it was harmless, that maybe had been offering to show Daniel a new game, that the footsteps walking away together weren't what they sounded like. The longer I sat there, the more I could hear what I didn't want to, and once I heard it, I could not hear it again. When the police came back the next day, she thought about handing over the tape. She thought about saying his name, but she also remembered the way her father spoke about him, how her mother had once said he's one of the only decent ones left in this town. So when Detective Harris asked her if she'd noticed anything unusual, she shook her head. She said she didn't remember anything. She tucked the cassette into a shoebox and pushed it to the back of her desk drawer. That was it, she said. I became part of the silence. The years that followed only made it harder. Every time she thought about telling someone, she pictured the look on her parents' faces if she was wrong. Or worse, if she was right. I couldn't bear the thought of them knowing they'd trusted him, that they'd let him in our house, let him near us. And as the decades passed, the town's memory of Daniel faded. People moved away. The playground was rebuilt. The man's name stopped being spoken in the neighborhood. But the tape remained, always in the same box, always just a few feet away. What made you decide now? I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. I'm running out of time, she said simply, and if I leave this world without saying it, then he wins, even if nothing comes of it, even if it's too late for justice. She leaned forward, then her eyes steady, the years momentarily stripped away. It's not just about what I kept from the police, it's about what I kept from Daniel. I owed him the truth. I still do. Emily said his name for the first time in over 50 years. It felt like the air in the room shifted. When she spoke it heavier, as if the syllables carried weight. Raymond Carter. The name meant nothing to me at first, just another ordinary small-town name, the kind that could belong to a coach, a shopkeeper, or the guy who fixed your gutters, and that was exactly how people had seen him back then. But Emily knew, and now I knew, that sometimes the most ordinary names hide the darkest stories. After Daniel disappeared, Carter remained in town for less than 6 months. There was no dramatic departure, no police escort, no public accusation. He simply told people had been offered steady work out of state and packed up. He even came to say goodbye. Emily said, her mouth tightening. He shook my father's hand, hugged my mother, and he put his hand on my shoulder like nothing had happened. The police never connected him to Daniel's case. Emily had never spoken up, and so he left with no stain on his name. I decided to dig old newspaper archives, painted a picture of a man who always seemed to be in motion, drifting from one small town to another, never staying longer than a few years. Each move was explained by a job opportunity or a family matter, always neat, always believable. But there were patterns in 3 different towns over the next 2 decades. Children had gone missing. In 1974, a boy vanished from a church picnic in Illinois. In 1978, a girl disappeared walking home from a county fair in Iowa. In 1982, a teenager went missing after leaving basketball practice in Nebraska. Each case drew local headlines for a few weeks, each faded into silence when no body was found. The most chilling detail: in all 3 towns, a man named Raymond Carter had been living there at the time of the disappearance. In Illinois, he was a handyman for the church. In Iowa, he worked at a hardware store near the fairgrounds. In Nebraska, he was listed as a maintenance supervisor at the local school district. In every case, he left within a year of the child going missing. I found a retired Nebraska detective named Samuel Ortega who remembered the 1982 case. His voice on the phone was gravelly, but his memory was sharp. "Yeah, I remember Carter," Ortega said. "Friendly guy, knew how to make himself useful. People liked him. But he had this way of showing up where he didn't belong, like he'd just be standing near the kids' locker rooms after games." Said he was fixing a light fixture. I asked if they'd ever considered him a suspect. "We did," Ortega admitted. "Problem was we didn't have anything to hold him on. No witnesses who saw him with the kid, no physical evidence. By the time we got serious about looking into him, he was gone." Emily sat in silence as I laid out what I'd found. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair until her knuckles whitened. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew he didn't just stop after Danny." The way she said it told me she had carried that suspicion like a stone in her chest for decades. Carter's trail went cold after the early 1990s. There were no more public records in his name, no obituary, no property deeds, no marriage licenses. It was as if he'd stepped out of the light completely. Somewhere out there, he might still be alive. Somewhere, he might have a different name. But the truth, at least the part we could see now, was undeniable. Daniel's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a shadow that had stretched across years and states, a shadow that moved whenever the heat got too close, and the only real piece of evidence linking Carter to any of it was sitting in a shoebox in Emily's living room. She looked at me, eyes wet but fierce. "I can't undo what I didn't say back then, but maybe I can stop someone else from keeping quiet now." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and for the first time that day, she let herself cry, not the sharp sobs of fresh grief, but the deep, silent kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. The playground was different now. The metal slide was gone, replaced by a bright plastic one in primary colors. The old swings had been swapped for new, safer models with rubber seats instead of hard slats. The merry-go-round, the one that used to spin slowly in the autumn wind, had been removed entirely, but the wind still moved through the place the same way, and the light on certain afternoons still fell, just so, catching in the branches of the oak trees and scattering gold across the ground. Emily stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, her hands curled loosely around the metal. She didn't speak for a long time. Her gaze roamed over the children, playing, their laughter sharp, unself-conscious, and I wondered what it was like to stand in the exact place where the axis of your life had shifted forever. Finally, she stepped forward. We walked the perimeter slowly, her pace measured, almost ritualistic. She pointed to the far corner where the blue sedan had been parked that day, to the spot near the restrooms where Shed called Daniel's name the second time. The time her voice had cracked. And then we reached the swings. They weren't the same, of course, new chains, new seats, but the poles holding them were in the same place. Emily moved to the second one from the left. Daniel's swing and sat down. The wind caught it almost immediately, making it sway gently. "When you're a kid, you think you'll forget the little details," she said, "but they're the things that stay." I remember the sound the chains made, the way the dirt kicked up under his shoes. I even remember the way his sweater looked in the sunlight, almost too bright for October. She looked down at her hands clasped in her lap. I used to dream about coming here and seeing him just sitting here, like nothing had happened, like the years in between had been a mistake around us, the air filled with the layered noises of a Saturday afternoon, a father calling out encouragement as his daughter climbed the slide, a group of boys arguing over who was it in. A game of tag, the rhythmic squeak of another swing somewhere behind us. It was a living scene full of movement, but it made the absence beside Emily even louder. This place isn't haunted, she said after a while, not in the way people mean when they say that there's no ghost here. The haunting is in me. She stood, then brushing off the seat of her pants. I thought coming back would give me something closure, maybe, but it doesn't. It just reminds me how much has changed and how much hasn't. As we walked back toward the fence, a gust of wind swept through, catching the swings in motion for a moment. The second one from the left swung a little higher than the others, its chain rattling softly. Emily paused, watching it. I used to think the wind was just the wind, she said. Then she turned toward the gate. 2 days after we visited the playground, I returned to Emily's house. The weather had shifted, the sun was out, but the light was thin, the kind that feels more like memory than warmth. Emily greeted me at the door with the shoebox in her hands. No preamble, no coffee, no polite small talk, just the box held like an offering. I've made up my mind, she said. We sat at the same table where Shed first told me about the tape. The afternoon light cut across the wood in angled stripes, touching the edges of the box, but not quite reaching the cassette inside. Emily rested her palms on either side of it. I've kept this so long, I don't even remember what it feels like not to, but I do know what it feels like to carry something that rots you from the inside. She looked at me, her expression level. I can't be the last keeper of this secret. When I'm gone, I don't want it to go with me. There was no romanticism in her voice, no cinematic swell of relief. The decision felt practical, almost businesslike, and yet beneath that I could hear the quiet tremor of fear. Once this is out there, I said, it can't be taken back. I know, she replied, and I'm ready for that. I wasn't ready before I was a child, and then I was too busy surviving. But now, she shook her head. Now, I'm just tired of silence. We talked through the options. She could take it directly to the police. She could have it analyzed by an independent investigator first. She could even release it publicly. Public, she said, finally, with a grim kind of certainty. Not because I want to embarrass anyone, not even him, but because I don't trust the quiet. Quiet is where this kind of thing grows. She lifted the cassette from the box and turned it over in her hands one last time. The masking tape strip on the side was even more brittle now, a small corner peeling away like it wanted to leave with her decision. This isn't just Daniel's voice, she said. It's the sound of a moment. I didn't stop, and maybe someone else will hear it and recognize the man's voice. Maybe it'll jog a memory. Maybe it'll make someone speak up. The room felt smaller, heavier. I realized we were both holding our breath. Then Emily slid the cassette across the table toward me. I want you to take it, she said. Make the calls, find the right people. I can't walk it into a police station, not after all these years, but I can hand it to you. Her hand lingered on it for a moment before pulling away. The sound of her fingertips leaving the plastic was almost imperceptible, but in that moment it felt loud. I picked it up. Its weight shockingly slight for something that had lived in her life, like an anchor. You're sure? I asked. She nodded. If I don't do it now, I never will. She stood, then stepping back from the table, like she was putting physical distance between herself and the choice Shed just made. Her face wasn't relieved exactly, but there was a slackness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the gutter somewhere down the street. A child's laughter carried faintly, and Emily's eyes flicked toward the sound before softening. Do me a favor, she said quietly. What's that? When you hand it over, don't tell them I'm sorry. I've been sorry long enough. The tape sat in my bag as I left Emily's house. Its weight, far greater than its size, could explain. The afternoon sun was dropping, laying long shadows across the quiet street. Somewhere a dog barked, a screen door creaked, and for just a moment it felt like 1970 again, as if time had folded in on itself, leaving the air charged with something unsaid. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I found myself steering toward the park. The playground was nearly empty now, the air cooler, the trees shifting in the slow rhythm of early evening. The laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by the steady whisper of leaves against each other. I walked along the fence until I reached the swings. The second one from the left was moving slightly, though there was no one on it, just the wind, gentle but insistent, making the chains rattle in that way I'd heard in the tape. Standing there, I thought about how sound works, how it moves in waves, how it bounces off surfaces, how it lingers in the spaces we don't notice. I wondered if Somewhere in the air around this park, some trace of Daniel's voice still existed, not in the way science could measure, but in the way memory works, layered, persistent, impossible to erase entirely. The tape held the last recorded moment of his life as we knew it, but the real recording was in Emily, in the way she carried his absence every day for 55 years, in the way she could still point to the exact spots her feet had touched when she searched for him, in the way she could still hear his laughter breaking off mid-swing. And now, with the cassette in my possession, I'd taken on a piece of that burden. The wind picked up, and the swing moved higher. For a second, the chain squeaked exactly the way I'd imagined it that morning in 1970. It was such a small sound, but it cut through the air like a voice calling across decades. I thought about how people say some stories don't have endings, that they simply taper into silence. But silence isn't nothing. It's filled with what we refuse to say, what we can't prove, what we can't forget. When I finally turned to leave, I glanced back once more. The swing was slowing, but still moving. It struck me then that the tape wasn't just a key to the past. It was also a reminder that the past isn't truly past. It lives in the wind, in the spaces between our words, and the shadows of people who walk away before we can name them. I don't know what will come of the tape. Maybe it will spark a lead. Maybe someone will recognize the voice and step forward, or maybe it will remain what it has been for half a century, a haunting, a question without an answer. But I do know this: Emily will never again be the only one who hears it. And sometimes that's the closest thing to justice you can get. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the final seconds of the recording, not the voice, not the footsteps, but the space after the hollow stretch where only the wind remained. It wasn't empty, it was full of everything we still didn't know.